Hello and welcome back to biology. Today we want to talk about homeostasis again, but this time we want to talk about water and ions, right? So the first thing we want to do is remember homeostasis is maintaining that internal stability, right? That you have some range of tolerance that the body needs to be at, and though that gets disturbed sometimes, but that there are mechanisms in place to bring it back. And those were the positive and negative feedback loops. And just to remind you, I've put in another little positive negative feedback loop, and that is feedback and coagulation. So let's say that you're injured, you have a break in your blood vessel, the damaged cells are going to release signals that will trigger clotting, right? Because here, this is starting a negative feedback loop, right? Because we have to bring it in. But within this is actually a positive feedback loop, right? So clotting begins, and that triggers the release of additional signals, and that's going to accelerate the clotting. And then eventually, right, so this is going to be positive, eventually that blood clot is going to plug the wall, and the bleeding is going to stop, and the signaling is going to stop. So this is just to remind you about negative and positive feedback loops that we've talked about before. But I thought it was cool that you should know about wounds and clotting. Okay, so, right, remember we've got all of these things that have to happen, right? You have metabolic activities that are going to need nutrients and oxygen, ions, things like that. You've got to expel waste products. You've got all sorts of changes that are going to occur with various cycles, specifically reproductive cycles, development, things like that. And then you've got responses just to challenges from the environment, okay? Now remember, there were three areas where we were talking about maintaining homeostasis. That is thermoregulation, which we talked about. That was body temperature. And then there's excretion and osmoregulation. Those are the things we're going to talk about today, okay? So excretion is the removal of waste products, and osmoregulation is maintaining the appropriate solute balance. Okay, so when we talk about excretion, there are four main functions of any excretory system. And of course, your excretory system involves your kidneys that filter your blood, right? And then you will produce a product that is a liquid that will take that waste out, and that's what urine is, right? And so that's our excretory system. There are different kinds of excretory systems in different animals, which we're not going to talk about. But here are the four functions of all of them. Filtration. You want to filter the blood, right, and get all of that stuff that you don't want out, but you need, and that's secretion, okay? You need to reabsorb everything you do want to keep, things that are valuable to your body. So as you are filtering this, some things are going to be secreted, some things will be reabsorbed, and then the stuff that is the stuff you don't want is going to be excreted, and that is excretion. Okay, so different animals are going to actually have different excretory products, but all of those come from the breakdown of proteins and DNA and RNA, because that's where your nitrogenous wastes are going to come from. In mammals, right, you're actually going to secrete urea, which is great because it's not toxic like ammonia. Okay, ammonia is easy to produce, but it's toxic, right? And it's really not very expensive energy-wise to produce. Birds and reptiles, right, they're going to produce uric acid, and this actually is going to be highly concentrated in them. The catch is, though, to reabsorb all that water, it's very energy intensive, right? It's non-toxic, but it's really expensive. Okay, so which processes in the human body produces nitrogenous waste out of the ones listed here? Well, cellular respiration for us, well, for everybody, is going to produce CO2. Ultrafiltration, that is where you are doing that secretion reabsorption thing in the excretory system. Osmoregulation is maintaining a water balance. So degradation of amino acids, which have nitrogen in them, that is going to be the process in this list that produces nitrogenous waste. All right, now let's talk about water. So we talked about how we get rid of things, but you want to be very careful how much water you get rid of, because if you don't have a lot of water coming in, then you probably don't want to get rid of a lot of water. And so this is osmoregulation, but we need a lot of water no matter what you are, because organisms, cells, right? Cells are water-based. I mean, the plasma membrane is hydrophobic, right? And so it makes this nice little membrane, but everything inside of that is water-based. Everything outside of that is water-based. So the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid in between cells, and then blood and hemolymph are water-based. Blood is in animals that have closed circulatory systems. Hemolymph is in animals that have open circulatory systems. And we're not actually talking about those two things because the open circulatory systems are going to be in invert. So let's talk about the way water is going to move, because the movement of water is very important to maintaining homeostasis, right? To maintaining this osmotic balance. When we talk about osmotic pressure, we're talking about the way in which water is going to flow. When we are talking about tonic, we are talking about solute concentration, right? And so when we have something that is isoosmotic or isotonic, that means that the body fluids and the external fluid are going to be the same concentration. And so that could be, say, inside of a cell and the extracellular fluid. It could be the animal and the water it lives in, for instance. But when that changes, when you have differences, and usually you do, you're going to have this flow. And in order to not have changes that are harmful for the body, it's going to require energy to maintain these concentrations, especially if there is a difference between the internal and external solutions. Now, ideally, right, you obviously would like to have something that is going to be the same, yeah. But let's say that you have a situation where you have a cell that has a higher concentration of solutes inside, right? And then the outside fluid is lower, okay, in concentration. That means that the water is going to want to flow to the higher concentration because there's less water to concentration, because remember, things flow from high to low. And so the osmotic pressure is going to be to the inside of the cell, okay? And in that case, right, the inside of the cell is going to be hypertonic, and the outside of the cell is going to be hypotonic, right? So hypo means lower, hyper means higher, okay? Now, by the same token, in this very same situation where you have that higher concentration of solute inside the cell, okay, it will also be hyperosmotic, because that is the way the water is going to flow. So the water will move into the cell, right, and so it will get more water, yeah, until you reach a balance between the two. So in that case, and in all cases, when something is hypotonic, it is also hypoosmotic. And when you're talking about these two, you have to be comparing two solutions. You can't just say that solution is hyperosmotic. Well, to what? So you've got to have two solutions that you're comparing in this case. And so we're going to talk about that in just a second and why it's important. Okay, but here's your question. To maintain fluid homeostasis or equilibrium, and when we talk about fluid homeostasis, we're talking about, osmoregulation. A cell needs to be surrounded by a solution that is hypotonic, isotonic, hypertonic, catatonic to the solution inside that cell. Well, remember, you don't want lots of flow, so isotonic would be the best, yeah? And so what you have to do is end up pumping solutes in or out of the cell, or water in or out of the cell to make that happen, okay? So here we have an isoosmotic aquatic organism, okay? The internal concentration of water and salt equal the outside, okay? But, right, that's not going to be true all the time, okay? What if you have a animal that lives in salt water? The outside water is going to be saltier, right? So it'll be hypertonic to the inside of the fish, which would be hypotonic. That means that water is going to have a tendency to flow out, and so the animal has to work very hard to keep enough water inside their body, okay? Now, or inside their cells. In a freshwater environment, the ion, we call it salt, but the ion concentration inside the organism is going to be higher, and so water is going to flow in, okay? And so that would mean that the inside is hypotonic or hypoosmotic, and the outside is hypertonic, hyperosmotic. And why is this a problem? Well, it turns out that dehydration becomes a very serious threat, right? And so animals that live in a terrestrial environment actually have really big problems. And dehydration can be a problem for marine animals too, right? Because of that salt difference. But we are terrestrial, so we want to talk about terrestrial. So dehydration, you've got to maintain a certain amount of water. So not only do you have to maintain the right concentration, you have to maintain the right amount, okay? And so there are different ways that we do this. When we look at water balance in a kangaroo rat, most of that is derived from their metabolism, right? And a lot of it is lost from evaporation because they live in a desert, and that's what keeps them cool. And they lose some to urine and, of course, some in their feces. And they get some of their water from their food. Humans, on the other hand, we drink lots of water. We get some of it from our food, and we get very little derived from metabolism, okay? We lose not as much to evaporation because we're typically not in a hotter place, and there's some other factors there too. But look at that. We lose lots of water in urine where these guys are conserving it. So we talk about conserving water. It is the kidney that I was talking about earlier that is the key to being able to keep the water where it needs to be, okay? And so the mammalian kidney produces urine that's much, much more concentrated than the rest of the body fluids, and we reabsorb the water that we need. Now, obviously, you're going to have to lose some water in urine. And by the way, this is why it changes color. I mean, the darker your urine, the higher the solute concentration, the less water you actually have in it, which is a big sign of dehydration because your body is desperately trying to save that water. And in birds and reptiles, this is even more. They save even more water, and that's why you get that paste that they have. That's the release of their nitrogenous waste, okay? So kidneys, though, really important to that. Now, there's osmoregulation in plants, too, of course, right? Water is lost at a very high rate through transpiration. When plants open their stomates, right, the stomata, these are the pores in their cells that allow gases to come in and out, right? So while they're taking in CO2 for photosynthesis, they're releasing some of the, right, a little bit from their respiration process, but they're really releasing lots of oxygen. So taking in lots of CO2, losing lots of oxygen. But for every one CO2 molecule that comes in, they can lose, on average, 500 water molecules out, right? That is a lot of water loss. And so they have to do various things to make sure that they're able to take in CO2, but they don't lose too much water. And so in drought times, transpiration has to be less than the water uptake. Now, if you've got lots of water, then you can just flow through the plant. But drier conditions require different things, okay? So here's your next question. Many more species of plants and animals live in a tropical forest than live in a desert. This difference is most likely due to the fact that compared to a tropical forest, a desert has less available sunlight, contains less water, contains soil with sand in it, and has more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. 4 is not true, right? 1 is not true. Deserts, lots of sunlight most of the time. It depends on the desert, but when we think about our hot deserts, they're getting lots of sun. More carbon dioxide? No, that's not going to happen, right? Less water? Definitely true. Sandy? Most of the time. But less water, and that's the key. Everybody needs lots of water to survive. So getting back to this osmoregulation in plants, this is what you have here, these little cells that are the guard cells, and they're going to open and close this pore, the stomate, right? And here you can see that it's actually closed, and this happens when we lose turgor pressure, which is the water pressure that's pushing out on the cells, right? That's pushing out, okay? Now, when you lose water, right, in these cells because they're starting to dehydrate, people think, oh, well, if we lose water, they're gonna swell and push closed, and I think lots of people learn that. But that's not really what happens. These cells are an interesting shape, and so when you lose water, they roll over to a different configuration, and when they roll, they have a bulge, and that bulge is actually what closes the stomate. Okay, now, right, all kinds of things happen. Now, to keep those stomates closed, right, there is the release of abscisic acid, which is a hormone. It's a plant hormone, so plants have hormones too. You also have a decrease in leaf growth, right? because you don't want to have too much leaf surface, because that is going to increase transpiration. So if you have less leaf surface, you have less transpiration. The leaves are going to wilt, they're going to roll, or just in general, expose less surface area to the air. So when those leaves wilt, it's a combination of things. It's a win-win, because there's less water in them, but also there's less water to be lost. And then roots will have a tendency to grow a whole lot deeper when there is less water, because they're, looking for water. If you have moist, really moist soil, that will actually give you shallow root growth. And so that's why you don't want to constantly water all of your plants. You want to let them get a little bit dry, and that way you'll have a good root system. So anyway, so there's a little bit about plants. All right, so this was just a brief kind of overview of osmoregulation. So please, if you have any questions, make sure you ask me in class. And that's it for this time, and thanks for listening.